The rain came down in sheets that November afternoon, turning the red clay roads of Watauga County into rivers of rust. Madison Lewis stood at the edge of the Patterson Creek Bridge, her police scanner crackling with static and fragmented voices. She was 23 years old, a junior reporter for the High Country Herald, and she had learned to trust her instincts, even when they led her to places like this, isolated, forgotten, wrapped in the kind of silence that felt deliberate. The call had come through 40 minutes earlier. Disturbance at the old Hemlock property, multiple units responding. That was all. But Madison knew these mountains, knew how words like disturbance could mean anything from a domestic dispute to something far darker. She had grown up in Boone, just 15 miles south, in a house where her grandmother told stories about these hills, stories about families who kept to themselves, about justice that sometimes never came, about secrets buried as deep as the mine shafts that honeycombed through the Appalachian rock. The bridge groaned beneath her boots as she crossed it. Below, Patterson Creek rushed with brown water, swollen from 3 days of rain. The Hemlock property sat another half-mile up the mountain, accessible only by a logging road that hadn't been maintained in decades. Madison had tried calling her editor, Dale Hutchins, but cell service died the moment she left the main highway. She was alone now, and some part of her, the part that had won her a scholarship to Chapel Hill, the part that had brought her back to these mountains instead of staying in Raleigh, knew that this was exactly where she needed to be. The first deputy she encountered was Tommy Brennan, a man she'd known since high school, when he'd been a linebacker and she'd been the girl who wrote about the games instead of attending them. He stood beside his cruiser at the base of the logging road, rain dripping from the brim of his campaign hat, his face carved with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not surprise at seeing her, not anger, something closer to resignation. "You need to turn around, Maddie," he said, using the nickname only her family used. "This isn't a scene for the press." "Tommy, I've been covering crime in this county for 2 years. I've seen worse than—" "You haven't seen this." His voice dropped, and he glanced back up the mountain where 3 more patrol vehicles were parked at angles, their lights painting the wet trees in rotating shades of blue and red. "Sheriff's on his way. Nobody talks to anybody until he gives the word. That includes you." Madison studied his face. Tommy Brennan wasn't the type to dramatize. He'd been the one to give her the straight story last spring when the Bryson fire had killed 2 children, hadn't sugar-coated the details even when they'd made her sick to her stomach. If he looked this shaken, something was deeply wrong. "How many people are up there?" "That's not—" "Tommy, please. I'm going to report this either way. You know I will." He exhaled slowly, breath misting in the cold mountain air. Behind them, another vehicle approached, a black SUV with county plates. Sheriff Marcus Webb, then. The man who'd run Watauga County law enforcement for 16 years, who'd been elected 5 times on promises of keeping these communities safe, who had a reputation for being fair but uncompromising. He looked at her with something approaching grief. "Ms. Lewis," he said, his voice formal in a way that immediately put her on guard. "I'm going to ask you to respect the integrity of an ongoing investigation and return to town. When we have information we're prepared to release, you'll be the first call I make." "With respect, Sheriff, the public has a right to know what's happening in their county. 7 people. That's what I'm hearing. 7 people found at the Hemlock property. That's a major incident by any standard." Webb's jaw tightened. For a long moment he said nothing, just stood there in the rain, water running off his jacket, his radio occasionally spitting out coded dispatches. Finally, he spoke, and his words carried the weight of a man choosing them very carefully. "There are children involved. Children who have been through trauma that I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy. Their safety and dignity are my primary concerns right now. Not your deadline, not your career, not even the public's right to know. Those children get protected first. Everything else comes after. Do you understand me?" Madison felt something cold settle in her stomach. Children. Trauma. The pieces were beginning to form a picture she didn't want to see, but couldn't look away from. "I understand," she said. "But Sheriff, if something criminal has been happening here, if children have been hurt, The community needs to know so they can... So they can what? Webb interrupted, and now there was heat in his voice. Form a mob? Burn down property before we've even completed our investigation? I've lived in these mountains my entire life, Miss Lewis. I know how fast rumor becomes gospel, how quickly people decide they know the truth before all the facts are in. I won't let that happen. Not this time. Not with this. He stepped closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. There's a little girl up there, maybe 6 years old. She's been asking for her mother, but she doesn't seem to understand that her mother is one of the people we're taking into custody. She's got marks on her arms, old scars and new bruises. She flinches when anyone moves too fast, and she's not the only one. So yes, Miss Lewis, I'm asking you to give us time to do this right, to gather evidence, to protect these kids, to build the case that will actually hold up in court instead of falling apart because some detail got leaked to the press too early. Madison felt her throat tighten. She thought of her own childhood, of Sunday dinners and her mother's garden, of feeling safe in a way she'd taken for granted until journalism had shown her how many children never felt that way at all. 24 hours, she said. Give me something in 24 hours. Even if it's just confirmation that children are safe and an investigation is ongoing. That's fair. Webb studied her for a long moment, then nodded once. 24 hours. But Maddie, when this story does come out, it's going to shake this county to its foundations. Make sure you're ready for that. He returned to his SUV and drove up the logging road, leaving Madison standing with Tommy in the rain. She turned to her old classmate, saw the tension in his shoulders, the way he kept glancing up the mountain as if something terrible might come rolling down it. What did you see up there, Tommy? He shook his head. Nothing I'm going to talk about. Not yet. But Maddie, remember when we studied the Civil War in Mrs. Henderson's class? How she talked about the difference between knowing history and understanding it? How you could read about battles and casualties, but until you stood on the actual ground where people died, you couldn't really comprehend what had happened? I remember. This is like that. Whatever you think happened up there, whatever you imagine based on what I've told you, it's going to be worse. Because some things you can't really understand until you're standing in the middle of them. And even then, part of you doesn't want to believe it's real. He climbed into his cruiser without another word, leaving Madison alone on the bridge with the rain and the rushing creek, and the knowledge that something had broken open in these mountains, something that had been hidden for a long time, festering in the dark places where no one thought to look. She returned to her car, a decade-old Honda Civic that had carried her through college and back again, and sat behind the wheel without starting the engine. Her notebook lay open on the passenger seat, already damp from the rain. She had written 3 words before talking to Tommy. Hemlock property, 7 people. Now she added, children, trauma, mother in custody. The pieces were there, but the picture remained obscure. The Hemlock property. She knew it vaguely, more as a landmark than a place. The Hemlock family had lived there for generations, but she couldn't recall ever meeting any of them. They were the kind of mountain people who kept to themselves, who came to town rarely, if at all, who existed on the periphery of community life like shadows at the edge of a photograph. Her phone buzzed with a text from Dale. Where are you? Need copy for tomorrow's edition. She stared at the message for a long moment before typing back, working a story, big one, need more time. His response came immediately. How big? Madison looked up at the mountain, at the rotating police lights visible through the trees, at the rain that showed no signs of stopping. She thought about the little girl Sheriff Webb had described, asking for her mother, covered in scars. She thought about Tommy's haunted expression. She thought about all the stories she'd covered in 2 years of journalism, the fires and the accidents, the petty crimes and the occasional tragedy. And she knew with absolute certainty that this was different. This was the kind of story that changed things, that revealed truths people would rather leave buried. Biggest story in county history, she typed back. Trust me.
She started the engine and drove back to Boone. But her mind remained on that mountain, in that place where 7 people had been found and children had been living with trauma no one had known about. The rain continued to fall, washing the mountains clean, while doing nothing to wash away the questions that were already multiplying in her head. Who were these people? How long had this been happening? Why had no one noticed? Or if they had noticed, why had no one said anything? And most importantly, what exactly had been done to those children that could make a veteran sheriff look like he'd stared into hell itself? Madison didn't know the answers yet, but she knew, with the certainty that made her a good reporter despite her youth, that she would find them. She would tell this story not because it would make her career, although it might, but because those children deserved to have their truth told, because silence in the end was just another form of complicity. The rain fell harder as she descended the mountain, and somewhere behind her, in a house she couldn't see, a little girl was probably still asking for her mother. That image stayed with Madison as she drove, as she planned her next moves, as she began the work of turning fragments into narrative, whispers into testimony, darkness into light. 24 hours, Sheriff Webb had said. It felt like both an eternity and no time at all.
Madison's apartment sat above Murphy's Hardware on King Street, in the heart of downtown Boone. It was small, just a bedroom, a bathroom barely large enough to turn around in, and a combination kitchen-living room that she'd filled with secondhand furniture and books. But it had tall windows that faced west toward the mountains, and on clear evenings, the sunset would paint those peaks in shades of orange and purple that reminded her why she'd come back here instead of taking the job offer from the Charlotte Observer. She'd grown up understanding that these mountains held stories. Her grandmother, Ruth Lewis, had taught her that. Ruth had been a school teacher for 40 years, had taught 3 generations of Watauga County children, and had known everyone's business without being a gossip. She died 2 years ago, just before Madison graduated from Chapel Hill, and it was Ruth's voice that Madison often heard when she was working on a difficult story. Don't just report what happened, child. Report why it matters. Report what it means for the people who have to live with it afterward. That evening, sitting at her small kitchen table with her laptop open and her notes spread around her, Madison thought about her grandmother and wondered what she would have made of the Hemlock property situation. Ruth had known the old families, had taught their children, had understood the complex web of relationships and histories that bound mountain communities together. She would have known who the Hemlocks were, what their story was, whether there had been signs that something was wrong. But Ruth was gone, and Madison was left trying to piece together a puzzle with too many missing pieces. She started with the property records, accessible through the county clerk's online database. The Hemlock property, officially listed as 847 Patterson Creek Road, had been in the family since 1887. 118 years of continuous ownership passed down through generations. The current deed holder was listed as Virginia Hemlock, age 47. No other names appeared on the title. Madison cross-referenced Virginia Hemlock's name with every database she could access. No criminal record, no civil suits, no marriage license on file in Watauga County, though that didn't necessarily mean anything. People got married in other counties, other states, all the time. She found a birth certificate. Virginia Marie Hemlock, born April 3, 1958, in Watauga County, parents listed as Robert and Eleanor Hemlock. She searched for Robert and Eleanor next. Robert had died in 1992, cause of death listed as heart failure. Eleanor had died in 1979. Madison calculated quickly when Virginia would have been only 21 years old. Cause of death, complications from pneumonia. The trail grew colder from there. No employment records for Virginia that Madison could find, which meant she'd either worked under the table or hadn't worked at all. No property tax delinquencies, though that meant someone was paying the bills. No utility accounts in her name, but that wasn't unusual for rural properties. Many still used well water and generators or solar panels instead of connecting to the grid. Madison leaned back in her chair, frustrated. Virginia Hemlock existed in the public record as a ghost, present enough to maintain property ownership, but absent from the normal flow of civic life. No voter registration, no library card, no memberships in any of the churches that kept such detailed rolls. It was as if she had deliberately made herself invisible, or as if someone had helped her stay that way. The phone rang at 8:30. Dale Hutchins, her editor, his voice rough from 40 years of cigarettes he supposedly quit a decade ago. "Tell me you've got something for tomorrow's paper," he said without preamble. "Working on it, but Dale, I need you to trust me on this. If we rush it, we might compromise the investigation." "The investigation into what, exactly? I've got Betty Parsons calling me every hour asking if it's true that someone was murdered up on Patterson Creek. I've got the mayor's office asking for comment. I've got half the county speculating about everything from a meth lab to a murder-suicide. You want me to print nothing? Let everyone else fill in the blanks with their imaginations?" Madison closed her eyes. Betty Parsons ran the Mountain Times, the weekly paper that served the smaller communities around Boone. She had a reputation for sensationalism that bordered on reckless, and if she was already making calls, the rumors were spreading faster than Madison had anticipated. "Print this," Madison said, making the decision as she spoke. "Print that sheriff's deputies responded to a call at a residence on Patterson Creek Road Sunday afternoon. Multiple individuals were taken into custody. The investigation is ongoing, and Sheriff Webb has asked for the public's patience while his department works to ensure the safety of everyone involved. Emphasize the word safety. Make it clear this isn't something people need to panic about, but also that the sheriff is taking it seriously." "That's it? That's all you're giving me?" "For now. Dale, I'm asking you to trust me. This story is going to be big, but only if we do it right. If we print speculation or half-truths now, we could end up hurting the people who have already been hurt the most." Dale was quiet for a long moment. "Webb told you about children, didn't he?" Madison's breath caught. "How did you—" "I've been running this paper for 30 years, Maddie. I know Marcus Webb. I know what makes him close ranks and go tight-lipped. It's always about protecting kids. So whatever's happening up there, it involves children who've been harmed, am I right? I can't confirm anything yet, but you're right." "All right, print what you said. But Maddie, tomorrow morning, I want you to start talking to people who knew that family. Find out who they were, what their story was, because when this breaks, and it's going to break whether we're ready or not, we need to be the ones who can explain how something like this could happen right under our noses for who knows how long."
After hanging up, Madison made herself dinner, a grilled cheese sandwich and tomato soup, her grandmother's comfort food, and tried to think about anything other than the Hemlock property. But her mind kept returning to Sheriff Webb's words. "There's a little girl up there, maybe 6 years old. She's been asking for her mother." Madison had never wanted children of her own, had never felt the pull toward motherhood that so many of her friends described. But she understood, in a way that made her chest ache, what it meant to be a child who needed protecting. She'd been 10 years old when her father left, when he decided that mountain life was too small for him and the flat expanse of Texas held more promise. She remembered her mother's quiet strength in the aftermath, the way Ruth had moved in for 3 months to help, the way her community had rallied around them with casseroles and offers to help with anything that needed doing. She'd been lucky. She'd been protected. She'd grown up knowing she mattered. But what about the children on Patterson Creek Road? What had their lives been like? What had they known? What had they endured? What kind of normal had been constructed for them in that isolated house on that forgotten mountain? Sleep, when it finally came, was restless and filled with dreams of rain and mountains and the sound of a child crying in darkness. Monday morning arrived cold and clear. The storm system finally pushed through. Madison was at the sheriff's office by 7 a.m., coffee in hand, prepared to wait as long as it took. But Sheriff Webb's secretary, Gloria Ramsey, a woman who'd known Madison since she was in middle school, just shook her head sadly when she saw her. "He's not here, honey. He's been up at the county hospital since 4 this morning. One of the children needed emergency medical care." "What happened? Is the child all right?" "I don't know any details, but Maddie, Marcus called me from the hospital, told me to tell you that he hasn't forgotten his promise. He'll give you what he can by end of day. He's a man of his word." Madison thanked her and left. But instead of returning to the office, she drove north toward Valley Crucis,
to a small farm where her grandmother's closest friend, Loretta Hayes, still lived. Loretta was 82 years old, had been born in Watauga County, and had never lived anywhere else. If anyone would remember the Hemlock family, it would be her. The Hayes farm sat in a valley carved out by the Watauga River, surrounded by mountains that seemed to cradle it protectively. Loretta was in her garden despite the cold, pulling up the last of the season's vegetables. She straightened slowly when she saw Madison approaching, her weathered face creasing into a smile. "Madison Lewis, your grandmother would be so proud of you, child. Come on inside. I just put on a pot of coffee." They sat in Loretta's warm kitchen, surrounded by decades of accumulated comfort. Photographs on the walls, quilts draped over chairs, the smell of wood smoke and cinnamon. Loretta poured coffee into mismatched mugs and settled into her chair with a soft groan. "Your visit wouldn't have anything to do with what happened up on Patterson Creek, would it?" she asked, her dark eyes sharp despite her age. "You heard about it? Honey, the only people in this county who haven't heard about it are the ones who don't have phones. Tommy Brennan's mother is in my quilting circle. She said her boy came home yesterday looking like he'd aged 10 years in one afternoon. Said whatever he saw up there shook him to his core. And Tommy served 2 tours in Iraq. Takes something powerful to shake a man who's seen what he's seen." Madison wrapped her hands around her mug, letting the warmth seep into her fingers. "What do you remember about the Hemlock family, Miss Loretta?" Loretta was quiet for a long moment, her gaze drifting toward the window where the morning light was painting the mountains gold. "The Hemlocks," she said finally, "were always a quiet family. Kept to themselves even more than most mountain folk, and that's saying something. Robert Hemlock, he was the last man to hold that property before Virginia took over. He was a strange one. Not mean exactly, just distant. Like he lived in a world the rest of us couldn't see. Did you know his daughter, Virginia?" "Saw her a few times when she was young. Pretty girl, dark hair, quiet as a mouse. She went to school here. Your grandmother taught her, actually. Would have been in the mid-60s, I think. Ruth used to worry about her." "Why? What concerned your grandmother?" "Virginia was too quiet. Too compliant. The kind of child who never asked questions, never caused trouble, never seemed to have opinions of her own. Ruth said it wasn't natural. Children are supposed to test boundaries, supposed to push back a little. But Virginia just existed. Like she'd learned early on that having wants or needs wasn't safe." "Did my grandmother ever report anything? Talk to social services?" "No, different times, child. Back then you didn't interfere in family business unless you saw actual bruises. And Robert Hemlock was careful. He came to parent-teacher conferences, paid his daughter's school fees, made sure she had decent clothes. On paper, everything looked fine. It was only if you paid attention to the girl herself, to how she flinched at sudden movements, how she never smiled, how she seemed to shrink into herself whenever anyone spoke to her, that you could see something wasn't right."
What happened after she finished school? She disappeared. Not literally. She still lived on that property, but she stopped coming to town. Robert did all the shopping, all the business. The few times anyone saw Virginia after that, she was always with him, always silent, always looking at the ground. Your grandmother tried to reach out a few times, sent notes home with Robert inviting Virginia to church socials or community events. Never got a response. Madison felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. And after Robert died, that's when things got really strange. Robert died in '92, like I said. There was a small funeral, maybe 10 people showed up. Virginia was there, dressed in black, didn't say a word to anyone. And after that, nothing. She just vanished into that property like it was another world. People would occasionally see smoke from the chimney, knew someone was still living there. But Virginia herself might as well have been a ghost. Did anyone ever go check on her? Make sure she was all right? Loretta's expression grew troubled. A few people tried in the beginning. The pastor from Cove Creek Baptist. He went up there a few times in the years after Robert died. Said Virginia answered the door but wouldn't let him inside, said she was fine and didn't need anything. After a while, he stopped going, said it felt wrong to keep pushing when she so clearly wanted to be left alone. What about social services, welfare checks? As far as I know, nobody ever called. See, here's the thing about mountain communities, Madison. We value privacy. We respect when people want to keep to themselves. That's part of the culture here. Not interfering, not judging, letting folks live their lives however they see fit. Usually that's a good thing. But sometimes, she trailed off, staring into her coffee mug. Sometimes privacy becomes isolation. Sometimes leaving people alone means leaving them to suffer in silence. And we can't always tell the difference until it's too late. Madison thought about the little girl Sheriff Webb had described, about the scars and bruises, about 13 years of Virginia's isolation. Miss Loretta, did anyone ever see Virginia with children, either pregnant or with young kids? Loretta's face went pale. Oh, Lord. There were children up there? I can't confirm anything officially, but yes, multiple children. Dear God. Loretta pressed her hand to her mouth. I never saw her with children. Never heard any rumors about it, but Madison, honey, that property is so isolated. You can't see the house from the road, can't hear anything over the sound of the creek. If Virginia wanted to hide something, or if she was forced to hide something, that would be the perfect place to do it. They talked for another hour, Loretta pulling up memories of the Hemlocks, of other families in the area, of the way mountain communities functioned and sometimes failed the people they were supposed to protect. By the time Madison left, the sun was high and bright, making the mountains look deceptively peaceful, as if nothing dark could ever happen in a place so beautiful. But Madison knew better now. She was beginning to understand that beauty and horror could coexist, that isolation could be both a refuge and a prison, that silence could hide a multitude of sins. She spent the afternoon at the county library, going through old newspapers on microfilm, looking for any mention of the Hemlocks. She found Robert's obituary, brief, listing no survivors except Virginia. She found Eleanor's obituary from 1979, also brief, mentioning her husband and daughter. She found a single photograph from 1961, a group shot of that year's graduation class from Watauga High School. Robert Hemlock stood in the back row, tall and thin, his face serious, his eyes staring at something beyond the camera's frame. As the sun began to set, Madison's phone rang, Sheriff Webb's number. Miss Lewis, I promised you 24 hours. Can you come to my office? 15 minutes later, Madison sat across from Sheriff Webb in his small, cluttered office. He looked exhausted, his eyes red-rimmed, his usually neat uniform wrinkled. On his desk sat a folder, thick with papers. Before I tell you anything, he said, I need your word that you'll handle this responsibly, that you'll think about those children first before you think about your story. You have my word, Sheriff. He opened the folder, and Madison saw photographs, printed images that made her stomach turn. Children's faces, gaunt and pale. Children's bodies marked with scars and bruises in various stages of healing. Children who looked at the camera with expressions that seemed far too old for their ages. 7 people, Webb said, his voice flat with suppressed emotion. 4 children, 2 girls and 2 boys, ages 6 to 14. 3 adults, Virginia Hemlock, age 47, and 2 other individuals were still working to identify. No identification cards, no birth certificates, no social security numbers for any of them. How is that possible? The children were born at home, never registered, never saw a doctor, never went to school. As far as the official world is concerned, they don't exist. The 2 other adults appear to be male, ages we estimate at mid-20s and mid-30s. They claim Virginia is their mother, but we're running DNA tests to confirm that.
Madison felt sick. And Virginia? What'd she say?
Nothing. She hasn't spoken a single word since we took her into custody. Not to us, not to the public defender, not to the children. She just sits there, staring at nothing. What about the children? What are they saying? Webb's jaw tightened. They're terrified. They're confused. They don't understand what's happening or why they've been removed from the only home they've ever known. The oldest one, a girl named Sarah, though we don't know if that's her real name since it's just what the others call her, she keeps asking when they can go home. She doesn't seem to understand that home was where they were being hurt. Can you tell me what happened to them? What kind of abuse are we talking about? Webb was quiet for a long moment. Then, physical abuse, neglect, medical neglect. All 4 children have untreated health issues. The youngest, a boy, has a broken arm that was never set properly and healed wrong. Malnutrition. The living conditions up there. He paused, closing his eyes briefly. Madison, I've been in law enforcement for 30 years. I've seen things that would give you nightmares. But I've never seen anything like what those children were living in. The house was falling apart, no heat except a wood stove, no running water, holes in the walls. The children slept on mattresses on the floor, thin blankets, inadequate clothing. There was food in the house, but not enough. Not nearly enough. Madison's hands shook as she took notes. And the 2 adult men, what were they doing? Based on what little we've been able to piece together, they were also victims. The working theory right now is that Virginia kept them isolated, controlled, possibly through a combination of psychological manipulation and physical intimidation. They're developmentally delayed, cognitively impaired in ways consistent with severe neglect and lack of education. We don't think they're perpetrators. We think they're victims, just like the younger children. So Virginia Hemlock did all of this? That's what the evidence suggests. But Madison, here's what keeps me up at night. This couldn't have happened in a vacuum. Those children existed for years. The oldest is 14 years old. 14 years of living on that property and nobody knew. Nobody reported anything, nobody thought to check. How does that happen? How does an entire community fail to notice that children are suffering right under their noses? It was the same question Madison had been asking herself. What happens now? The children are in protective custody. We're working with social services to find appropriate placements. Virginia has been charged with multiple counts of child abuse and neglect. We're still investigating, still gathering evidence. And Ms. Lewis, I'm telling you all of this because I need you to help me make sure this never happens again. I need you to write a story that makes people in this county understand that privacy can't be an excuse for neglect, that leaving people alone can sometimes mean leaving them to die. I'll do my best, Sheriff. I know you will. Your grandmother taught you well. Madison left the sheriff's office as the sun disappeared behind the mountains, turning the sky deep purple and then black. She drove back to her apartment, made herself dinner she couldn't eat, and opened her laptop. The words came slowly at first, then faster, pouring out of her like something that had been building pressure for days. She wrote about Virginia Hemlock, about the woman who herself had been a victim of isolation and control, who had perpetuated that same cycle onto her own children. She wrote about the failure of community, about the way good intentions and respect for privacy had created the perfect conditions for horror. She wrote about the children, careful to protect their identities but making clear what they had endured. And she wrote about the questions that remained. How had Virginia managed this for so long? Where were the fathers of these children? How had 4 births happened without anyone knowing? What would become of these children now that they'd been thrown into a world they'd never been prepared for? By the time she finished, it was 3 in the morning. She sent the story to Dale with a simple note, "This is the truth, printed." Then she lay down on her couch, too exhausted to make it to her bedroom, and slept dreamlessly for the first time in days. The story ran on Wednesday morning, November 9th, 2005, taking up the entire front page of the High Country Herald and continuing on to pages 3 and 4. Madison had titled it simply, "The Children of Patterson Creek, How Isolation Became Imprisonment." By noon, the phone in the newspaper office had rung so many times that Dale had to assign someone specifically to answer it. Some callers praised the reporting, saying it was time someone shed light on what had happened.
Others accused the paper of sensationalism, of invading privacy, of making mountains out of molehills. But most, the vast majority, simply wanted to know more. They wanted to understand how this had happened in their community, under their watch. The story spread beyond Watauga County within hours. By Wednesday evening, reporters from Raleigh, Charlotte, and even national news outlets were calling, wanting interviews, wanting access, wanting their own angle on the story. Madison turned most of them down, focusing instead on the follow-up reporting she knew was necessary. Because the initial story was only the beginning. Now came the harder work of understanding not just what happened, but why. On Thursday morning, she drove to the Department of Social Services, where she'd arranged to meet with Sandra Whitfield, the director. Sandra was a compact woman, in her late 50s, with steel gray hair and the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who'd seen too much suffering and refused to let it break her.
"You understand I can't discuss specific cases," Sandra said as they sat in her office, the door closed against the chaos of the main waiting area. "But I can't talk about the systemic issues that make cases like this possible." "That's exactly what I need to understand. How does something like this happen? Don't you do welfare checks? Don't you investigate when children aren't registered for school?" Sandra leaned back in her chair, her expression weary. "In a perfect world with unlimited resources, yes, we'd catch everything. But Madison, we're responsible for every child in this county, and that's thousands of children. We have 6 caseworkers, 6 people trying to monitor, investigate, and protect an entire county's worth of kids. We can only respond to reports. If nobody calls us, if nobody raises a concern, we have no way of knowing a problem exists." "But these children were never registered for birth certificates. Doesn't that trigger some kind of flag?" "Only if someone reports the birth. Home births happen in this county all the time. It's part of the culture. Midwives are supposed to file paperwork, but not all of them are certified, and not all births are attended by anyone official. The system relies on voluntary compliance. If a parent chooses not to register their child, and nobody reports that omission, the child simply doesn't exist in our records." Madison felt frustration building. "So you're saying there could be more children like this? Kids who are living off the grid, unregistered, potentially being abused, and nobody would know?" Sandra's expression grew even grave. "I'm saying that any system built on voluntary reporting and limited resources has gaps. And people who want to abuse children are very good finding those gaps and exploiting them. What about the school system? Don't they notice when children aren't enrolled? We have a truancy officer, but again, they can only track children who are registered in the first place. If a child never enters the system, if they're never enrolled, never vaccinated at a public clinic, never seen by a doctor who files reports, they're invisible. And in a rural county like this one, where homeschooling is common and perfectly legal, where people value independence and privacy, it's even easier for children to fall through the cracks." Madison scribbled notes furiously. "What happens to the Hemlock children now? Where do they go?" "I can't discuss their specific placement, but generally speaking, children removed from these kinds of situations face enormous challenges. They're traumatized. They have no education, no social skills, no understanding of how the world works. Finding appropriate foster homes for one special needs child is difficult. Finding placement for 4 siblings who all need intensive therapeutic support? That's nearly impossible. So they'll be separated? Most likely, at least initially. We'll try to keep them in contact with each other, but the reality is that we simply don't have foster families equipped to handle this level of need, and group homes aren't appropriate for children this traumatized." Sandra leaned forward, her voice dropping. "You want to know the real tragedy, Madison? Even though we got them out, even though they're safe now, the damage has already been done. Those children are going to struggle for the rest of their lives with what was done to them. The 6-year-old who was asking for her mother? That was Virginia, the woman who starved her, who isolated her, who let her suffer with untreated medical issues. But Virginia was still her mother, and that child still loves her. How do you explain to a 6-year-old that the person she loves most in the world was hurting her?" Madison had no answer. She thought about her own mother, about the unconditional safety she had always felt, and tried to imagine what it would be like to grow up without that foundation. She couldn't. After leaving the DSS office, Madison drove to Cove Creek Baptist Church, where she'd arranged to meet with Reverend James Cooper, the pastor who had tried to check in on Virginia Hemlock in the years after her father died. He was waiting for her in his small office, a man in his 70s with kind eyes and hands that trembled slightly as he poured them both coffee. "I've been waiting for someone to ask me about this," he said heavily. "Been carrying the weight of it since Sunday, wondering if I could have done more. Tell me about your visits to the Hemlock property." "There were 3 of them, maybe 4, all within the first 2 years after Robert died. So that would have been 93, 94. Virginia's mother, Eleanor, had been a member of this church before she passed, so I felt a responsibility to check in on Virginia, make sure she was all right. The first time I went up there, Virginia answered the door but wouldn't let me inside. Said she appreciated my concern but didn't need anything. She was polite but firm." "Did she seem afraid? Under duress?" "That's what I've been asking myself. At the time, I thought she was just shy, maybe grief-stricken, but looking back, knowing what I know now..." He trailed off, shaking his head. There was something in her eyes, something empty, like she wasn't really there, if that makes sense. "Did you see anyone else? Hear anything unusual?" "No. The house was quiet. I didn't see any signs of other people, but Madison, I only ever stood on the front porch. I never went inside. I never insisted. And after a few visits where she made it clear she wanted to be left alone, I stopped going. I respected her privacy. You couldn't have known. But should I have known? Should I have pushed harder? That's what keeps me up at night. I'm a pastor. My job is to care for my flock, to look after the vulnerable, and I failed. I let my respect for her privacy override my responsibility to make sure she was safe. And because of that, children suffered for years."
Madison heard the anguish in his voice and understood that this story had more victims than just the Hemlock children. It had wounded an entire community, had forced people to confront their own complicity, their own failures to act. "Reverend Cooper, was there ever any gossip about Virginia? Any rumors about her having children?" "Not that I heard. And believe me, in a small community like this, if there had been rumors, they would have reached me. The church ladies know everything. If someone had seen Virginia pregnant or seen children on that property, word would have spread. The fact that no one knew suggests she was very, very careful to keep them hidden. Or that no one was paying attention. That too," he admitted quietly. By Friday, the story had exploded beyond anything Madison had anticipated. Cable news picked it up. The AP wire carried it nationally. Suddenly, the High Country Herald phone was ringing with calls from producers, from advocates, from lawmakers, all wanting information, all wanting to discuss what this case meant for child protection laws in North Carolina. Governor Mike Easley's office issued a statement calling the situation deeply troubling and promising a full review of child protective services across the state. The local district attorney, Brian Harrison, held a press conference announcing that additional charges were being considered against Virginia Hemlock and promising that justice would be served. But it was the reaction from the community itself that hit Madison hardest. On Saturday afternoon, she attended a town hall meeting that had been hastily organized at the Boone Recreation Center. More than 300 people showed up, an extraordinary turnout for a county whose entire population barely topped 40,000. They filled the main hall, spilling into the lobby, their faces reflecting a mixture of shock, anger, guilt, and confusion. Mayor Scott Reynolds opened the meeting with a somber acknowledgement of what had happened and a promise to ensure it never happened again. Then he opened the floor for comments. The first person to speak was Martha Greer, a woman in her 60s who ran a daycare in town. "I want to know how this happened," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "I want to know how 4 children could be born and raised in this county without anyone knowing, without anyone seeing them. We have systems, we have rules, we have people whose jobs are to protect children, and they failed. We failed." There were murmurs of agreement throughout the hall. The next speaker was Tommy Brennan's mother, Carol, her voice stronger than Martha's, but carrying the same pain. "My son was one of the first responders at that house. He came home and couldn't eat dinner, couldn't sleep that night. What he saw up there, the conditions those children were living in, it changed him. And I want to know what we're going to do to make sure no other deputy has to see something like that again. What we're going to do to make sure no other children suffer like those kids suffered."
Sheriff Webb stood up then, his face grave. "Mrs. Brennan, I can promise you that we're reviewing all of our protocols. We're looking at ways to identify at-risk properties, to do better outreach, to create systems that catch these situations before they reach this point. But I need the community's help. We can't do this alone. If you see something that concerns you, if you know of a family that's isolated, if you hear rumors about children who aren't in school, call us. Let us investigate. It's better to check and find nothing than to not check and let children suffer." Madison stood near the back of the room, taking notes, watching the community process its collective trauma and guilt. She saw teachers who wondered if they should have asked more questions about homeschooling families. She saw neighbors who remembered seeing smoke from the Hemlock property and never thought to wonder who was up there. She saw doctors who acknowledged they had no system for tracking children who never came in for care. The meeting lasted 3 hours, and by the end, several action items had been proposed. A task force to review child protection protocols, increased funding for social services, a community education campaign about recognizing and reporting child abuse, and a memorial to ensure the Hemlock children were never forgotten. As people filed out, Madison found herself approached by an elderly woman with sharp, intelligent eyes. She introduced herself as Patricia Sullivan, a retired social worker who had moved to Boone 15 years earlier. "I read your article. It was good, fair. But there's something you need to understand about cases like this, something most people don't want to acknowledge." "What's that?" "Virginia Hemlock is both perpetrator and victim. The kind of isolation and control she subjected her children to, that's learned behavior. That's generational trauma being passed down. Robert Hemlock did the same thing to her, and someone probably did it to him. This didn't start with Virginia. It started generations ago, and it continued because no one intervened, because mountain culture values privacy and independence so highly that we sometimes let it become neglect." So, what's the solution?
The solution is hard. It means changing culture. It means accepting that sometimes privacy is dangerous. It means building systems that can identify at-risk families without violating their rights. It means providing support before crisis hits, not just responding after children have already been traumatized. And it means acknowledging that the good old days, when everyone left everyone else alone, weren't actually that good. They were just convenient for people who wanted to avoid difficult truths. Madison thought about that conversation all weekend as she worked on her follow-up articles. She interviewed more community members, more officials, more experts. Each conversation added layers to her understanding of how the Hemlock case had been possible, how a combination of geographical isolation, cultural values, systematic underfunding of social services, and individual failures had created the perfect conditions for horror. On Monday morning, a week after the initial discovery, she published a comprehensive analysis titled "How Privacy Became Prison: The Systemic Failures That Enabled the Hemlock Case." It examined each breakdown point: the lack of birth registration requirements, the absence of mandatory wellness checks for homeschooled children, the underfunding of social services, the cultural reluctance to interfere in family matters. She included expert commentary, statistical analysis, and specific policy recommendations. The article sparked intense debate. Some readers praised it as necessary and important. Others accused Madison of attacking mountain culture, of suggesting that privacy was inherently dangerous, of advocating for government overreach into family life. The criticism stung, but Madison stood by her reporting. She knew the difference between respecting privacy and enabling abuse. And she knew that the Hemlock children deserved a community willing to have difficult conversations about how to prevent similar cases in the future. On Tuesday, she received a call from an unexpected source, Dr. Helen Marquez, a child psychologist who had been brought in to evaluate the Hemlock children.
She wanted to meet, off the record, to help Madison understand what the children were facing. They met at a small cafe on the outskirts of town, away from the prying eyes and ears of the community. Dr. Marquez was a woman in her 40s, with a calm professional demeanor that Madison immediately trusted. I can't tell you anything that would identify the children specifically, but I can talk about the general psychological impact of the kind of extreme isolation and control they experienced. I'd appreciate that. I want people to understand what these children are dealing with. The first thing you need to understand is that their entire worldview has been shattered. Imagine living your whole life in one small space with only a handful of people, following rules that seem arbitrary and absolute. Then, suddenly, you're pulled out of that world and dropped into a completely different one. Nothing makes sense anymore. The rules are different. The people are different. Everything you thought you knew about how the world works is wrong. That must be terrifying. It's beyond terrifying. It's disorienting to the point of causing actual psychological breakdown. We're seeing signs of severe anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress. The children don't know how to interact with other people. They don't understand basic social cues. They've never watched television, never heard music, never been to a park or a store or a school. Simple things that most children take for granted, like choosing what to eat for breakfast or deciding what clothes to wear, are overwhelming for them because they've never been allowed to make choices. Madison's pen moved rapidly across her notebook. What about the physical abuse, the scars Sheriff Webb mentioned? The physical abuse was definitely present, but honestly, the psychological abuse was worse. These children were systematically denied everything that makes childhood meaningful. Play, exploration, education, socialization, affection. They were treated as objects to be controlled rather than as people with inherent value. That kind of fundamental denial of humanity leaves scars that no amount of therapy can completely heal. Can they recover? Can they ever have normal lives? Dr. Marquez was quiet for a moment. They can have better lives than they had. They can learn to function in society, form relationships, maybe even thrive in certain contexts. But normal? No. What was done to them fundamentally altered their development during critical periods. The oldest child, for example, 14 years of severe deprivation during the years when the brain is developing most rapidly. That child will carry those effects forever, even with intensive intervention. What happens if they're separated, if they can't stay together? That's another trauma on top of everything else they've experienced. Those siblings are each other's only source of continuity, the only people who understand what they've been through. Separating them means taking away their primary support system at the exact moment they need it most. But the reality is that finding a placement that can handle all four, with all their complex needs, is almost impossible. Madison felt rage building in her chest. Rage at Virginia Hemlock for creating this situation, rage at Robert Hemlock for starting the cycle, rage at a system that couldn't adequately care for the victims it was supposed to protect. Is there anything else people should know? Anything that would help the community understand? Yes. Tell them this. These children are not damaged goods. They're not broken beyond repair. They're human beings who survived unimaginable circumstances. They're resilient. They're brave. They deserve our support, our patience, our commitment to helping them build better lives. And tell them that the best way to honor these children is to make sure it never happens to anyone else, to fix the systems that failed them, to create a community where isolation isn't allowed to become imprisonment.
The following week, Madison attended Virginia Hemlock's arraignment. The courtroom was packed with spectators, journalists, and community members who wanted to see the woman who had inflicted such suffering. Madison secured a seat in the second row, her notebook ready. When Virginia was led in, Madison was struck by how ordinary she looked. She'd expected a monster, but instead saw a thin, pale woman in an orange jumpsuit, her dark hair streaked with gray, her face blank of expression. She moved slowly, mechanically, as if her body was present but her mind was somewhere far away. The charges were read: 4 counts of felony child abuse, 4 counts of child neglect, 4 counts of false imprisonment. The list went on. Each charge carried potential decades in prison. Virginia stood motionless as they were read, showing no reaction, no emotion, nothing. Her public defender, a young man named Richard Moss, who looked barely out of law school, entered a plea of not guilty. Then he did something unexpected. He requested a psychological evaluation for his client, suggesting that she might not be competent to stand trial. The request sparked immediate controversy. The district attorney objected vehemently, arguing that Virginia had been competent enough to maintain her abuse for years and therefore was competent enough to face justice. Judge Catherine Morrison, a stern woman in her 60s, ultimately granted the evaluation request, setting a hearing for 6 weeks later to review the results. As Virginia was led out of the courtroom, Madison found herself studying the woman's face, looking for some sign of humanity, some indication of what was happening in her mind. But there was nothing. Virginia Hemlock was a closed book, and Madison suspected that even when that book was finally opened, the story inside would be more tragic than anyone wanted to believe. Outside the courthouse, Madison was approached by a group of protesters carrying signs that read, "Justice for the Hemlock children," and "Never again." Their leader, a fiery woman named Rebecca Santos, who ran a local domestic violence shelter, pulled Madison aside. "We need to use this case as a catalyst," Rebecca said urgently. "We need to push for real change. Mandatory reporting laws, better funding for social services, regular wellness checks for all children, regardless of whether they're enrolled in school. This can't just be a tragedy that everyone talks about for a few weeks and then forgets. These children deserve more than that." "I agree. What are you proposing?" "A coalition, bringing together social workers, teachers, law enforcement, healthcare providers, community advocates, everyone who touches the lives of children. Creating a comprehensive safety net so that kids can't fall through the cracks the way the Hemlock children did. And we want you to cover it. Keep this story alive. Keep pressure on the legislators and the county commission until real changes are made." Madison agreed without hesitation. This was exactly the kind of follow-through she'd known would be necessary. The initial shock and outrage were important, but they weren't enough. Real change required sustained attention, sustained pressure, sustained commitment. Over the next 2 weeks, Madison attended meeting after meeting of what became known as the Watauga Child Safety Coalition. She watched as the group hammered out specific proposals, built consensus, recruited members, and prepared to present their recommendations to the county commission. She documented every step, publishing articles that kept the Hemlock case in the public consciousness, even as newer stories competed for attention. She also continued investigating the Hemlock family history, trying to understand how the cycle of abuse had started and been perpetuated. She discovered that Robert Hemlock's father had also been isolated, had also kept his family separate from the community. The pattern stretched back at least 3 generations, maybe more. She interviewed distant relatives who remembered hearing whispered stories about the Hemlocks, strange people who didn't mix, who followed their own rules, who seemed to exist in their own separate reality. But no one had ever investigated. No one had ever thought it was their business. Privacy had been respected, and children had suffered as a result. The psychological evaluation of Virginia came back in mid-December. Dr. Marcus Chen, a forensic psychologist brought in from Chapel Hill, concluded that Virginia was competent to stand trial, but recommended that her mental state be considered as part of any eventual sentencing. His report, portions of which were made public,
painted a picture of a woman who had been so severely abused and controlled throughout her life that she quite literally didn't understand that what she had done to her children was wrong. She had been raised in isolation, taught that the outside world was dangerous, conditioned to believe that her father's rules were absolute. When he died, she had simply continued the only pattern she knew. The report didn't excuse her actions, but it contextualized them in a way that made the case even more tragic. Virginia Hemlock wasn't simply evil. She was the product of generational abuse, a victim who had become a perpetrator because she had never known any other way to be. The question that Madison kept coming back to, the question that seemed to haunt everyone involved in the case, was this: where did responsibility begin and victimhood end? At what point did being controlled stop being an excuse for controlling others? There were no easy answers, but as Christmas approached and the Hemlock children faced their first holiday away from the only home they'd ever known, separated in different foster placements across the region, Madison knew that whatever answers eventually emerged, they needed to include a commitment to breaking the cycles of abuse that had allowed this case to happen.
On December 23rd, the Watauga Child Safety Coalition presented their proposals to the county commission in a packed meeting room. Madison sat in the press section, watching as Rebecca Santos delivered a powerful presentation about the systematic changes needed to protect vulnerable children. The commission voted unanimously to adopt several of the recommendations, including funding for 2 additional social workers, creation of a community outreach program for isolated families, and partnership with local schools to develop better identification procedures for at-risk children. It wasn't everything the coalition had asked for, but it was a start. As the meeting ended and people filed out into the cold December night, Madison felt something she hadn't felt since this story began: hope. Not for the Hemlock children, their damage was done, their struggles would continue for years, but hope that maybe, just maybe, the horror of their case would prevent similar horrors in the future. She drove home through streets decorated with Christmas lights, past houses where families were gathered safely together, and thought about 4 children spending their first Christmas apart, in unfamiliar homes, surrounded by strangers who were trying their best, but couldn't possibly understand what those children had endured. And she thought about Virginia Hemlock, sitting in a cell, silent as always, perhaps finally feeling safe for the first time in her life, even as she faced the consequences of the harm she had caused. The story was far from over. The trial would come, the children's futures would unfold, the community would continue to process and heal. But tonight, Madison allowed herself to believe that something good might come from something terrible, that the Hemlock children's suffering might at least serve as a catalyst for protecting others. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. But it was something. The new year brought with it a bitter cold that settled over the mountains like a judgment. January 2006 arrived with snow and ice, making the roads treacherous and the world feel smaller, more isolated. Madison found herself thinking about the Hemlock children during those frozen days, wondering if they were warm, if they were safe, if they understood that the cold outside was nothing compared to the cold they'd endured inside that house on Patterson Creek. The trial was scheduled for March, but before it could begin, the case took an unexpected turn. On January 12th, Madison received a call from Richard Moss, Virginia Hemlock's public defender. He wanted to meet, and he wanted it to be off the record. They agreed to meet at a diner in Blowing Rock, far enough from Boone that they were unlikely to be recognized or overheard. Moss looked exhausted when he arrived, carrying a briefcase that seemed too heavy for his thin frame. He ordered coffee and barely touched it, his hands wrapped around the mug as if seeking warmth. "I need your help," he said without preamble. "I need you to help me tell Virginia's story." Madison kept her expression neutral. "I've been telling Virginia's story. She's the perpetrator in one of the worst child abuse cases this county has ever seen. She's also a victim, and I don't think anyone understands that yet. Dr. Chen's report made it clear that she was abused, that she was raised in isolation,
But that doesn't excuse what she did to her children. I'm not asking you to excuse it. I'm asking you to understand it, to help other people understand it. Moss opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. Virginia has started talking, not much and not about the abuse itself, but she's been telling me about her life, about what her father did to her. And Madison, it's worse than anyone imagined. Against her better judgment, Madison felt her reporter's instinct kick in. Tell me. Virginia Hemlock was never allowed to leave that property after her mother died, not once in 27 years. Her father kept her there, controlled every aspect of her life. He told her the outside world was evil, that everyone in it would hurt her, that the only safety was in isolation. He beat her when she questioned him. He denied her food when she disobeyed him. He made her dependent on him for literally everything: food, water, warmth, human contact. And then, when he got sick, when he knew he was dying, he told her that her job was to continue what he had started, to protect the family, to keep them safe from the evil world. And the children? Where did they come from? Moss's face went pale. This is the part that's going to make people sick. The 2 adult males, the ones we thought might be Virginia's children, DNA confirmed they are. And Madison, Virginia wasn't her mother in any consensual sense. Robert Hemlock raped her daughter repeatedly over years. Those men are the product of incestuous rape. They're Virginia's children and her half-brothers. Madison felt bile rise in her throat. Dear God! And the 4 younger children, based on DNA testing, they're products of incest as well, born from relationships between Virginia and her 2 sons. Whether those relationships were forced or whether Virginia, by that point, couldn't distinguish between the abuse she had experienced and the abuse she was perpetuating, that's the question I'm struggling with. Madison couldn't find words. The horror had layers she hadn't imagined, depths she hadn't wanted to explore.
Generational trauma, Moss said quietly. A cycle of abuse so complete, so totalizing, that Virginia literally didn't know any other way to exist. She wasn't keeping those children isolated because she was evil. She was doing it because it was the only thing she knew how to do, because her father had taught her that isolation was safety, that control was love, that the outside world was the enemy. But she had chances. After her father died, she could have left. She could have reached out for help. Could she? Think about it. She'd spent her entire life being told that the outside world would destroy her, that people were dangerous, that the only safety was within the walls of that house. Then her father dies, and suddenly she's responsible not just for herself, but for 2 young children, products of rape, cognitively impaired because of the inbreeding and the neglect. She has no education, no skills, no understanding of how the world works. Where was she supposed to go? What was she supposed to do? Madison shook her head. There were resources, social services, churches, people who would have helped. How would she know that? She'd been told her whole life that those institutions would take her children away, would punish her, would destroy what little she had. And you know what? She was right. That's exactly what happened. The moment the outside world found out about her situation, her children were taken away and she was arrested. From her perspective, everything her father told her came true. Madison sat back, her mind reeling. She thought about the protesters outside the courthouse, about the community's rage, about her own anger at Virginia Hemlock. All of it had been based on seeing Virginia as a perpetrator, as someone who had chosen to hurt children. But what if there had never been a choice? What if Virginia had been as trapped as her children, locked in a cycle she couldn't break because she didn't even know it existed? "Why are you telling me this?" she asked finally. "Because the prosecution is pushing for the maximum sentence, potentially life in prison. And while I understand the impulse, while I understand that people want justice for those children, I think there's a different kind of justice that needs to be considered. Virginia Hemlock is 57 years old. She's developmentally stunted, psychologically damaged, completely institutionalized. Putting her in prison for the rest of her life accomplishes what exactly? It doesn't help her children, it doesn't prevent future cases, it just satisfies our collective need to punish someone for a tragedy that's bigger than any one person. So what are you proposing? A plea deal. Virginia pleads guilty to the charges in exchange for a sentence that includes mandatory psychiatric treatment, long-term supervised care in a mental health facility, and restrictions that ensure she never has access to children again. She accepts responsibility for the harm she caused, but she also gets treatment for the harm that was done to her. And maybe, just maybe, her case becomes an example of how generational trauma works, how abuse perpetuates itself, and what we need to do as a society to break these cycles. Madison thought about it for a long time. You want me to write about this, to help build public support for a plea deal? I want you to tell the complete truth, not just the story of what Virginia did, but the story of what was done to her. Both things can be true at the same time. She can be responsible for terrible harm while also being a victim of circumstances beyond her control. The community won't like it. They want someone to blame. I know, but you're not a journalist who gives people what they want to hear. You're a journalist who tells them what they need to know. That's why I came to you. Madison drove home through the January cold, Moss's words echoing in her mind. She spent the next week struggling with how to report this new information, how to add complexity to a story that the community had already decided was simple. Evil woman hurts children. Evil woman gets punished. Justice served. But justice, Madison was learning, was rarely that simple. She started with the facts. She reviewed Dr. Chen's psychological evaluation in detail, obtaining permission to quote extensively from it. She interviewed experts in generational trauma, in incestuous abuse, in the psychological impact of extreme isolation. She built a case piece by piece that showed how Virginia Hemlock had been manufactured by her father's abuse, shaped into someone who could only perpetuate the patterns she'd been taught. The article she finally published, titled "The Making of a Monster: How Abuse Becomes Inheritance," ran on January 26th. It was her longest piece yet, over 5,000 words, and it required readers to sit with uncomfortable truths about cycles of violence, about how victims become perpetrators, and about the inadequacy of a justice system designed around clear distinctions between innocent and guilty. The response was immediate and fierce. Half the community praised her for adding necessary complexity to the conversation, for refusing to let the case be reduced to simple good versus evil. These readers saw Virginia Hemlock as both perpetrator and victim, saw the need for a justice system that could hold both truths simultaneously. The other half accused Madison of sympathizing with a child abuser, of making excuses for inexcusable behavior, of re-victimizing the Hemlock children by suggesting their mother deserved compassion. Letters to the editor poured in, some threatening, some pleading, all passionate. Dale called her into his office the morning after the article ran. "You've stirred up a hornet's nest," he said, but he was smiling slightly. "Good. That's what journalists are supposed to do."
Can learn healthier ways of thinking and being. Your mother would never be able to be around you or your siblings again, but she might be able to find some peace. Then that's what I want. I want her to have peace, because she never did, not even once in her whole life. And maybe if she finds peace, that means the bad things stop, that they don't get passed down anymore. The debate raged through February. spilling out of Watauga County and into state and even national conversations about criminal justice, about mental health, about how society should respond to perpetrators who are themselves products of severe abuse. And then, on February 14th, something unexpected happened. Sarah Hemlock, the 14-year-old, the oldest of the children, asked to speak with Madison. The request came through Dr. Marquez, who called Madison on a Tuesday afternoon. Sarah has been following the news coverage. She's been reading your articles, and she wants to talk to you about her mother. Is that allowed? Is it legal? Her caseworker has approved it with strict conditions. You can't use her real name. You can't publish anything that would identify her specifically, and the interview has to happen in my presence so I can ensure Sarah's well-being is protected. They met 3 days later in Dr. Marquez's office, a warm space filled with comfortable furniture and artwork clearly chosen to be soothing. Sarah sat in an armchair near the window, and Madison's first thought was how small she looked. 14 years old, but tiny, underdeveloped, her body showing the effects of years of malnutrition. But her eyes were sharp, intelligent, aware. "Thank you for meeting with me," Madison said carefully. "Dr. Marquez said you wanted to talk about your mother." Sarah nodded. Her voice, when she spoke, was soft but clear. "Everyone's angry at her. Everyone thinks she's a monster, and I don't know how to explain that it's more complicated than that. Tell me what you want people to understand." "She hurt us. I know that. She didn't feed us enough. She didn't teach us things. She kept us locked up. But she also loved us. I know that sounds crazy, but she would tell us stories at night. She would sing to us sometimes. When we were sick, she would stay up with us. She was our mother, and she tried in the only way she knew how." "Did she ever explain why you couldn't leave? Why you had to stay hidden?" "She said the outside world would hurt us, that people would take us away from each other, put us in different places, make us forget who we were. And she was right, wasn't she? That's exactly what happened." "But Sarah, you're getting medical care now, education. You're learning about the world. Doesn't that feel better than being isolated?" Sarah's expression was conflicted. "It feels different. Not better or worse, just different and scary. Everything here is so loud, so bright, so fast. There are so many rules I don't understand. So many people who look at me like I'm broken. Sometimes I miss the quiet. I miss knowing what each day would be like. I miss my brothers and sister." Tears formed in her eyes. "They split us up, just like my mother said they would. My sister Grace, the 6-year-old, she's 2 hours away. I can't see her. I can't make sure she's okay. How is that better?" Dr. Marquez intervened gently. "Sarah, remember what we talked about. The separation isn't permanent. It's temporary while everyone gets the help they need." "But it feels permanent. It feels like everything my mother warned us about came true." Sarah looked at Madison directly. "I read what you wrote about her, about how she was hurt too. And I wanted you to know that I knew that. She had scars just like we do. She would wake up screaming sometimes. She was afraid all the time. And I think she was trying to protect us from whatever scared her so much. She just didn't know how to do it in a way that didn't hurt us." Madison chose her words carefully. "What do you want to happen to your mother now?" "I don't know. Part of me is angry at her. Part of me misses her. Part of me wants her to be punished for what she did to us. But another part of me wants her to get help, to learn that the world isn't what she thought it was, to understand that she could have made different choices. I don't want her to be locked up forever. I want her to be fixed. Is that possible?"
Madison glanced at Dr. Marquez, who gave a slight nod of permission. I don't know if anyone can be completely fixed, Sarah, but with treatment, with therapy, with time, people can learn to understand themselves better. That child has more wisdom than most adults I know. She's been through hell, and she's still capable of empathy, of seeing her abuser as a complex human being rather than just a monster. That's extraordinary. It also makes the story more complicated, Madison said. The primary victim is asking for mercy for her perpetrator. How do I report that without it seeming like I'm advocating for lighter consequences? You report it exactly as it is. You let Sarah's voice be heard, and you trust your readers to sit with the complexity instead of demanding simple answers. Madison published the interview, carefully anonymized, with Sarah referred to only as the oldest Hemlock child, on February 20th. The article, titled "In Her Own Words, A Victim Speaks About Her Mother," created another firestorm of reaction. In November 2005, journalist Madison Lewis's career-defining story began when police discovered 7 people living in complete isolation at a remote Watauga County, North Carolina property. What they found would expose generational cycles of abuse and spark 2 decades of legal, social, and personal transformation. The Hemlock family had lived hidden for years. Virginia Hemlock, her 4 minor children, Sarah, 14, Grace, 6, and 2 others whose names remain protected, and 2 adult males, later identified as James and Michael, Virginia's brothers, who had never been given official names and suffered severe developmental disabilities. The children had never attended school, seen doctors, or interacted with anyone outside their immediate family. They lived in squalor, malnourished, and isolated with no understanding of the outside world. As the investigation progressed, the case's complexity deepened. DNA evidence revealed Virginia had been sexually abused by her own father, who had fathered several of her children through incest. Virginia herself was both perpetrator and victim. Raised in isolation and abuse, she had replicated the only family structure she knew. The 2 adult males were also victims, cognitively stunted from lifelong abuse and neglect. Sarah, the eldest child, provided the most articulate account of their existence. In interviews with Dr. Alina Marquez, a child psychologist, Sarah described a world of 6 people where fear was constant, hunger normal, and her mother's warnings about the dangerous outside world seemed protective rather than controlling. She had no framework for understanding that what she experienced was abuse. The prosecution initially sought harsh penalties, but the case's complexity forced reconsideration. District Attorney Brian Harrison's office faced an unprecedented situation. Clear harm to children, but a perpetrator who was herself a product of multi-generational abuse with no real agency or understanding of alternatives. Public defender Richard Moss argued for psychiatric treatment over punishment. The community divided sharply. Some demanded harsh justice, while others, including surprisingly Sarah herself, advocated for recognizing Virginia's own victimization. In March 2006, a plea agreement was reached. Virginia pled guilty to child abuse and neglect charges, receiving 25 years in a secure psychiatric facility with mandatory treatment. James and Michael were placed in specialized care facilities. The 4 children entered state custody, with eventual adoption as the goal. The children's recovery trajectories varied, but ultimately proved remarkable. Sarah became the story's most visible survivor. Initially traumatized by her rescue, she gradually adapted to the world, discovering education, libraries, and possibilities she'd never imagined. She pursued psychology, earned advanced degrees, and became a clinical psychologist specializing in childhood trauma.
By 2015, she publicly identified herself while testifying before the North Carolina legislature, helping pass Sarah's Law to strengthen protections for isolated children. She married, had children, and transformed her trauma into purpose. Grace, adopted by a specialized family in Asheville, thrived in a stable home environment. She eventually pursued social work, ironically working for the same Department of Social Services that had rescued her, implementing reforms sparked by her own case. The two middle children, names perpetually protected, built lives including careers, relationships, and families of their own. One even becoming a parent, representing hope that cycles could truly break. James and Michael, severely developmentally disabled, would never achieve independence, but found dignity in residential care with routines, friendships, and lives far better than what they'd endured. For Madison Lewis, the case became a defining 20-year commitment. Initially a young journalist at the Watauga County Herald, she approached the story with nuance that earned trust from subjects and readers alike. She refused to sensationalize, instead exploring the case's painful complexities, how victims could become perpetrators, how isolation enabled multi-generational abuse, how justice systems struggled with cases that defied simple narratives of good versus evil. Her reporting won awards, influenced policy, and kept the story alive in public consciousness. But it also took personal tolls, nightmares, therapeutic intervention for vicarious trauma, and the burden of bearing witness to such profound suffering. She found purpose in believing that stories matter, that journalism could drive meaningful change. The Hemlock case catalyzed substantial reforms across North Carolina and beyond.
The county transformed the Hemlock property into a memorial park with trails and a plaque reminding visitors of community responsibility to vulnerable members. Annual memorial ceremonies became spaces for recommitment to protecting children. Virginia Hemlock died in 2010 after 5 years of psychiatric treatment. She had made slow progress in understanding both the abuse she'd suffered and inflicted, but never reconciled with her children. Her death brought complicated emotions, particularly for Sarah, who had achieved sophisticated understanding. Recognizing Virginia's victimhood without excusing her actions, understanding without forgiving. By November 2025, at the 20th anniversary memorial, the transformation was complete. Sarah stood with her husband and children, a family built on love and safety. Grace brought her fiancé. The middle siblings came with their own families. James and Michael, now in their 50s, attended with caregivers. Sarah's keynote address captured the essence of their collective journey. 20 years ago, 4 children were pulled from darkness into light. The transition was traumatic. It was painful. It was necessary. She emphasized that breaking cycles requires community support, systemic commitment, and collective vigilance. Individual resilience alone isn't enough. The Hemlock case demonstrates that justice in trauma cases is rarely simple or satisfying. No outcome could restore lost childhoods or undo genetic impacts of generational incest, but meaningful change occurred. Children were protected, systems improved, awareness increased, and survivors not only recovered but thrived in ways that seemed impossible initially. Madison's final reflection captured the bittersweet reality. The case taught her that journalism at its best bears witness to complexity, refuses easy narratives, and honors both suffering and resilience. The Hemlock children's legacy wasn't just surviving their mother's trauma, it was choosing healing over perpetuation, breaking cycles that had persisted for generations. 20 years later, the mountains still hold this story, serving as both warning and inspiration. Isolation enables harm, but community can heal. Trauma perpetuates itself, but cycles can break. Justice is imperfect, but change is possible. The work continues, as it always must, to protect those who cannot protect themselves. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel.